Now live from New York. Very good evening to you, Sherwin. Thank you so much for joining us as always. Do we know what the latest path of this storm is? I know that the threats of this storm has sent shivers, both realistically and metaphorically speaking.
Well, I'll tell you, Simpiwe, it's not coming to New York. It's a little bit south of where we are on the northeastern seaboard of the United States, down near the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, just above Georgia, Florida being the most southern state on the eastern seaboard. So about 2 states up from that, South and North Carolina will be taking a direct hit. We understand that this will be the first time since about 1954 that those states will suffer a direct hit from a Category 3, Category has now been downgraded to a Category 3, but it still has a way to go before it reaches the coastline of South and North Carolina, so it could in warm waters again strengthen. There were fears that it would strengthen to a Category 5. All options remain on the table, but this is a multi-state event. South and North Carolina will take a direct hit, but the outer bands of this hurricane will reach Georgia. It will reach inland into states like Tennessee, Alabama, even Kentucky, Delaware to the north. So this is a multi-state event, and I think the big concern here is not necessarily the sweeping winds that will come in. It's about flooding. You have both the storm surge, essentially water being pushed with those winds from the ocean, and then the water coming down from the clouds and the rain combines to create havoc on the ground. And this is why you have mandatory evacuation orders in multiple coastal areas. 1 million people have been told, get out away from the coast, get as far inland as you can because of what is known as the storm surge. If you think back to last year, Simpiwe, you'll remember those images of Hurricane Harvey. The concern wasn't so much that this hurricane was a Category 4. What became the biggest concern was that this hurricane sat once it reached the coastline, once it moved from the sea level to the inland level. Whatever then happens, I mean, you'll have to speak to meteorologists about this, but it sat there for days. It dumped many millimeters of rain, and flooding is the major concern. This is why people have been told to get out. And of course, the big concern is we don't know, given the longevity of this hurricane and its path, when people will be able to return to their homes.
Sherwin, you just mentioned Hurricane Harvey, which took place last year, but then it wasn't as hectic as Hurricane Florence is made out to be. Now, this storm is likened to Hurricane Katrina, which hit New Orleans a few years ago. Just how prepared for this storm is the United States compared to what was a glaring failure, to help people in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina?
I think there's an element of misconception regarding Hurricane Harvey as opposed to Hurricane Katrina. If we look at the cost estimates, Simpiwe, of damage, these were equivalent. They created equivalent amounts of damage. I think the number was about $125 billion in damage for both Katrina and Harvey. So on record, these are probably the most 2 devastating hurricanes experienced in the United States, and essentially that is half the GDP of the entire South African economy. So this is a huge cost issue for countries like the United States. Look, I think the United States is prepared. I think they were prepared for Harvey. The only problem is people couldn't get back into their homes because, Mother Nature is Mother Nature. You can prepare all you want. The problem is flooding and access to roads, and roads were not passable. People had to get boats to go and rescue people. And the big concern, I think, for authorities is people that are not heeding the calls to evacuate. This is one of the big concerns. FEMA and first responders have made it clear that there will become a point in the longevity of this hurricane where they will not be able to go and save people, whether they're on rooftops or stuck in their homes. So really the concern here is that people need to heed these orders. The president on Twitter has been making a very visible play of this, cancelling rallies that he was supposed to have, campaign rallies, of course, an election in November. Simpiwe really cancelling those to really emphasize the need for people to heed the instructions of officials, given the great unknowns that exist when these weather systems reach land.
Now, Sherwin, I'm reading a warning by the Federal Emergency Management Agency Administrator, Mr. Jeff Byard, saying that this is not going to be a glancing blow. This is going to be a Mike Tyson punch to the Carolina coast from Thursday into the weekend. And he says that today is the last good day to evacuate. It does suggest that the storm is imminent. It's going to be much sooner than we may have anticipated.
Well, they say that it could start reaching some of the eastern parts of South Carolina by tonight, actually. But the majority of the storm should be hitting Thursday night, and then the concern is that it's going to down and hover as it reaches the coast and then rain like it did with Harvey for 3 days. That is the big concern here. It is flooding. I mean, as much as we talk about 200-kilometer winds, if you button everything down, you see people at stores buying wood panels to put over their windows. You can do a lot to mitigate the effects of sweeping winds. What you cannot do is deal efficiently with sitting water, and especially when it keeps piling on further. The winds will bring that water from the coast onto low-lying areas, and then you also have water being dumped from above. And that really is the concern. Will people be stuck in their houses if they don't get out soon enough? So he's absolutely right. And if I remember Mike Tyson correctly, I mean, ask Evander Holyfield how that ear is feeling today.
Well, we have people, as you've mentioned, who because of poverty cannot evacuate or be evacuated. We do understand. Are there any state interventions to help such people?
Well, thousands of National Guard troops have been deployed to those 3 states, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia in particular. In addition to that, as you say, people can't fill up their cars if you're poor, fill up your car and drive to a Holiday Inn and check in there. There's a great cost implication for poor people, and they simply don't have the funds for that. So what the states have done is they've opened up shelters around those states. All the shelters have been opened. They did this with Katrina. Of course, that failed dismally, but shelters have been open, and poor people, and certainly whosoever you might be, have been encouraged to go and seek shelter, or if you have the means, to drive out from away from the coastal areas and get as far inland as possible, given the concerns around storm surge, Simpiwe.
Now, the Washington Post editorial has declared that President Trump is, well, I quote unquote, is complicit for this storm. Just how is the White House taking the news?
Well, it's been all hands on deck from the White House. I think they've, certainly from a federal important lessons from previous events. Of course, Hurricane Maria last year creating such devastation in Puerto Rico. A new report recently coming out at some 3,000 people, and not the 60 some odd that was initially quoted. 3,000 people lost their lives. This is a greater number than even Katrina in the New Orleans, Alabama area. So a great deal of concern from the federal agencies. But as you say, in terms of the Washington Post editorial board calling withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And that editorial comes when there are 3 hurricanes in Atlantic Ocean, one bearing down on the southern states of the United States, and also the week in which the Secretary General of the United Nations gave a very powerful policy speech about climate change and the lack of ambition that we are seeing from political leaders, despite the historic and landmark Paris Climate Change Agreement of 2015. There's a great deal of concern that not enough Simpiwe is being done, certainly not enough investment in the green economy is happening fast enough to mitigate the impacts that we are seeing today. I mean, there was a figure I was reading that the Secretary General talked about the cost of climate change and natural disasters to the United States economy, some $240 billion a year. And his concern is that by 2030, this could be some $2 trillion to the global economy per year. So the argument is that the cost of doing nothing is far greater than the benefits that come with actually investing in the green economy. I mean, you have the United States, for example, reopening old coal power stations. You see the Trump administration rolling back mitigating efforts by the placed regulations, placed by the Obama administration, whether you talk about methane gas being emitted into the atmosphere, the house gases that contribute largely to climate change. You see the Trump administration rolling back regulations that have been put in place here in the United States. So there's a great deal of concern that all hands are not quite on deck as is needed, and certainly what the Paris Climate Change Agreement envisaged.
And it's so sad, Sherwin, that each storm has a political dimension to it. It's now being highly politicized. Politicians, I would imagine, are now wrestling each other over the climate science denial that is common attitude coming out of the White House. Is that correct?
It's always a big debate, certainly in countries like the United States. In fact, the Republican Party is known as the only major political party anywhere in the world that hasn't fully embraced the science around climate change. And the science is very clear. Climate change is happening. It's happening at a very rapid pace. And the Paris Climate Change Agreement was certainly what was required, was thought then in 2015, required to mitigate the effect. The focus in the United States is no longer on what the White House is going to do, given their withdrawal from the Paris Climate Change Agreement. You see cities, you see states, you see governors like Governor Brown of California going around circumventing this White House and implementing the goals and the ambitions set out in the Paris Climate Change Agreement. You see philanthropists like Michael Bloomberg working closely with the United States. So it's all going to come down to what cities are doing, what states are doing, particularly in an instance where the federal government has washed its hands of this process.
And apparently a strong performance by President Donald Trump might boost his approval ratings, wouldn't it say?
Absolutely. Whenever there's a disaster, whether you talk about 9/11, George Bush's popularity ratings were in the doldrums when 9/11 happened, and when that happened and he rallied the country around their response to that tragedy, you saw his poll numbers go up. So I think any federal or government response to a natural disaster, if they are seen to be doing something, is very important, particularly in an election year.
All right, Sherwin, thank you so much for joining us, and please keep safe. And you would actually do much better as a weather presenter. Thank you so much for joining us.